What do queer and trans kids and youth need from their communities?
How would I know? I'm not a queer or trans kid or youth. Why the heck would you ask me that? So my first answer is they need you to listen to them so they can tell you what they need.
What I hear from youth, particularly queer and trans youth, is that they want to be listened to and valued in their community and be given real information and trusted and validated in their experience.
I think that honestly, they need what all young people need, in my opinion, which is acceptance and understanding.
Like just listening to them and helping them be and feel seen and known for who they are. I think that's the biggest thing that we all need, and particularly when we're thinking about young kids, which is where I've done the most work. Like that's the biggest thing. Like when I asked somebody, like, what would you have wanted from your preschool teacher? The response was just to have listened to me.
We often dismiss kids as being too young to know who they are, and yet I don't know who they are, yet, right? Like they know who they are.
My child in particular, I'm going to speak about that. Something that she's been very clear about is for us as adults not to impose our views and to take her full range of emotions and thoughts and ways of identifying as real and clear and valid, right? So, and what I mean by that is by not making statements like, oh, this is just a stage. You're only saying that because you're a kid. You haven't been on this earth for that long. So you don't, you're only saying that because you don't really know. And that's something that for sure young people in general, and certainly queer youth don't need to hear, that it's so disregarding their feelings and experiences or minimizing it, right?
Our queer and trans youth need, it's that safe space and know that they belong there and that they're needed there.
Safe spaces outside of school and their home. That's what I would want as a kid, where you can just hang out and do what you please. Like, but preferably places where you aren't expected to spend money. So this could look like a mall, I guess, but a library is a great place, I think, too. So, or other community spaces that just literally have places to sit and talk or consume media.
To live in a space where they feel understood and accepted.
Space to figure themselves out, figure each other out, space for their identities to form and shift and change, space to be listened to and heard. And with that, I also mean actual physical space. Like I think that being heard is one thing, but you also need material support. Like queer and trans kids need homes and food security, and need the spaces that they do go to not to be hostile.
They need access to accurate information about their health, about who they are, about their communities, about their options, about resources. And for resources in particular, they need to actually have a really good sense of what's safe and what's not. So you may only have one shelter for youth in a county. Are they actually competent to be able to provide support for that young person? And the answer is more often than not, no. There is a lot of organized anti-queer, anti-trans sentiment that is allowed to slide.
Being able to physically get to or access a doctor who will listen and affirm and believe you, and also have the skills or knowledge to be able to provide gender transition related care, to have gender affirming therapists, so like a therapist that will have some understanding and framework of like what gender is and how to support somebody in exploring and coming in and connecting with their own experience of gender.
These youth serving organizations need to have training and accountability because training doesn't fix anything. right? Just training doesn't fix anything. So resourcing accurate information, which also means like consistent internet access. Consistent high-speed internet access is better. So if that's only available in libraries, if that's only available in school, then we also need to make sure that the sites that are blocked as pornography or inappropriate don't just include words like gay. Don't just include words like breast, because someone may need to actually like go and find out information about breast development at 14 because they don't have anybody to talk to. Or if they do talk to someone, then that person's immediately going to know that they're a trans man. And coming out like that is not safe.
I'd consider how the space, perhaps its policies or resources that are in place, see if those could use some updates to be more trans inclusive.
They need at least one trusted adult.
The research really says that like the more role models that kids have that reflect who they are, the better they do. And so as long as communities are not talking about it or not providing that stuff, then kids are still having to figure it out for themselves.
We're talking about young people who often have at least been dealing with low-level rejection from important people in their lives. And that may not be family, that may be friends, that may be school, that may be therapist, that may be just walking down the street and feeling like that you're never quite safe. And we're also dealing with a lot of folks who are getting active, organized, anti-queer, anti-trans feelings and bias aimed against them.
Access to supportive adults, and especially supportive adults who identify as queer, and really the ability to see themselves. Because a big issue is the ability to, see themselves and envision themselves as adults, and that they can have, really full, rich lives as queer adults. So those positive role models are also incredibly important.
I think it would have been really helpful if I'd had folks that were like role modeling what it looked like to be an adult that was queer. Because it wasn't until I was in college that I met a lesbian couple that had been married for many years and like could see like what stable adulthood might look like. Or like I met a trans person that had been living their identity for a very long time. And I think that makes a huge difference for kids in those communities.
How do we make sure kids know that who they are is good and right? I have some ideas that I think we can talk about later, but on a basic level, we all need to talk more, regardless of if you're straight or gay. As adults, we need to talk more about gayness, queerness, being trans, as if that's a normal and everyday and totally awesome thing to do and be. And that could be a spectrum to getting comfortable with talking about that. But I think that's a baseline thing that folks need. They need to feel like they're okay, acceptable, and they exist.
So if you can be that one safe person though, that they can actually talk to and get answers from, and when you don't know, you say, I don't know, let's figure it out together, great.
People who are willing to see their identities as something that should be celebrated and honored within our communities rather than something that needs to be discussed or denigrated by any means.
I'd rather have a reputation, and honestly, I'd rather y'all have a reputation as the scary person who's gonna protect the hell out of those kids than, oh, but they're so nice to work with.
What queer and trans youth need is what we all need, which is community and love and support, and to be able to flourish within environments that see themselves reflected, especially in a future sense. So being able to see queer and trans adults thriving and knowing that there is a future that they will be able to thrive in.
Yeah, it's so hard to envision what your future is when everyone in your, that you're surrounded by, you're all, 16 years old. You have no idea what's going to happen in the future, and there's no kind of a guiding, adult guiding, I don't know if guidepost is the right word, but like guiding figure to let you know that it's all going to be okay, that you're going to grow up, that you're, if you're in a bad situation, that you will be able to escape from it and be fully who you are and be accepted.
youth also need community. And that doesn't necessarily mean that they have to be connected to a huge wide network of other LGBTQ plus youth, although that does help. And online is a great way to connect with those folks.
Opportunities in the community to do things that are fun and meaningful and be around positive people.
Being able to connect with other people and just talk about and say things like, I'm feeling this way, does anybody ever feel this way? And to hear from a peer, yeah, I've also felt that way about my body, or yeah, I don't know what to do with dating, or yeah, I get confused about this too, or yeah, this has been helpful, and for me to figure this out is really, really useful. And I will also say that, honestly, a straight, cisgender adult person that they connect with can also be that, to just normalize what you're feeling. You know, if somebody's like, I feel really alone because I don't know anybody like me, that's really easy to affirm, or to say, I feel this way about my identity, and I don't know if it's just weird or other people. Let's find out together if there's other people who feel that way. There's books, there's articles, there's people to connect with on Facebook. Like, you can also help support that youth in that way.
Queer and trans youth want people to call them by the right pronouns and their names.
Our work should be very much intersectional. So taking into consideration that our queer and trans youth definitely come with queer and trans experiences, but they're also very unique along with their needs. Specifically in the work that I do at Landmark College, we're a school for neurodivergent students. So everyone's needs are so individual. But when I think of kind of the basics of community, it's belongingness, it's the ability to be one's full self. And when I talk about belongingness, I like to think of belongingness more than just like telling someone they belong in a space. I think belongingness is really about when they're absent, when they're not in the space, do you recognize that they're not there?
What do queer and trans kids and youth bring to their communities?
From my perspective, they bring what kids bring. They bring joy, they bring creativity and curiosity, and that opportunity to see the world in new ways. And every kid is different, and every kid brings something different into the world.
This question makes me want to cry because, like, what does any kid bring? So the kids I know bring humor, they bring intelligence, they bring fun, they bring brattiness, they bring everything that any awesome human being brings to the world.
Just like any human being, I think that queer trans kids are going to have blind spots in their thinking, but I've noticed that I think that they, in my experience, are quicker to like access and understand or appreciate different lenses of like intersectionality. So different identities and holding those at once, like, and being hungry for new perspectives. And again, this is coming from the perspective of a librarian being behind a desk and talking about books and talking about like, where are the resources?
Queer and trans youth bring so much knowledge. It's such a gift to be a young queer and or trans person, because we're talking about someone who is so well in touch with themselves that they are able to look beyond what the culture or society has told them that they are supposed to be, and instead have been able to dive deeper in and really truly understand themselves on a deeper sense. And on top of that, when they have the safety and ability to come out and to share that with others, they are only broadening the worldviews of those around them.
They are really sort of as a collective thinking really deeply about who they are and where they fit in the world. And in doing that, they think they challenge the rest of us to do the same if we are open to doing that.
Even though I do this for a living as a social justice educator, there's so much that I'm learning from my 11-year-old.
My personal belief is that queer and trans kids are magical.
Queer and trans youth are conjurers. Like, they are conjuring new language, they are conjuring new ways of connection, new ways of understanding your body, new language, new family structures. I think we should always be looking to our queer and trans youth for reimagining the world.
So when we start talking about, for example, gender and all of the stuff that we have built on gender, which includes sexuality, which includes family, which includes how we organize relationships, which includes lots of really ridiculous laws and medical things. To be able to just go, yeah, I'm opting out of that. And so then I have to figure out other ways to be and other ways to explain myself. And it's really a powerful thing to watch and support and advocate with young people who are just stepping into their power and their creativity.
One of the things that I love about queer and trans youth is that they have such expansive ways of thinking about gender and sexuality. Something that like really blew my mind even like 6 or 8 years ago when I was working at Camp Outright for LGBT youth, was just like how nonlinear young folks are thinking about gender. Like some older generations is like, oh, well, there's more than male or female. And they're like, well, actually, I'm not just non-binary. I'm also like genderqueer and I'm also like masculine, but I'm also like femme, and like I'm like a gender constellation that like doesn't even fit on a line. And so I just like feel like so inspired the ways that not only young folks can think outside the box, but they can create really their own like frameworks and metaphors for understanding their experience.
I was like amazed when I had my first queer theory classes. I'm like, oh my God, this is a wild way, like finally, like this is how I can think about my body and this is how I can think about relationships. And there are like high schoolers and middle schoolers with like this high, I'm saying high not to create a hierarchy, but like this broad, infinite way of understanding identity and connections that I find genius.
I think they are the most brilliant youth on this earth, mainly because it is, as we know, so difficult to be able to come out within a heteronormative and very transphobic society. But when folks are able to do that work and to understand themselves, not only are they able to flourish, but they are only making their communities more diverse, exciting, and ever more beautiful.
I'm 10 years older than my sister, my little sister, and I remember coming out was like this really weird, difficult process for me. And I remember we were in the car and I was just like, Rico, I am a lesbian. And it was like this huge thing for me. And she was like, so what? She's like, my best friends are bisexuals and so am I. Like, it was like just that discrepancy and how I had all of this anxiety and all of this like holding and rigidity. And she was like, no, of course you are. Like, what are you holding on? Like, what's the issue? Like, that shift, I think, is brilliant.
They bring diversity of thought. They bring diversity of experience. I was able to, I facilitated in grad school, I was able to facilitate a research study around how male identifying folks viewed their masculinity. And it was great to kind of get the queer perspective. I had a couple students that identified as queer in that space, and their perspective really made for there to be some really transformative learning on behalf of those who were not within that identity. You know, we live in a system where my queer experience is not something that is readily open for discussion. You know, it's not really welcomed in all spaces. So in spaces where there is room for that voice, there's so much learning that can come from that.
They are sort of really busting open the world of what my generation and generations that are older than me have thought that the world was, and that we made a lot of assumptions, and they're just busting open those assumptions, and thank goodness.
Bringing openness and like the pushing of the boundaries and the envelope, you know, in a way that I see as positive because it's transformative.
Just their abilities to break down boundaries. I've heard some folks I think it was on a trip I was on last year, refer to use queer as a verb, meaning to, break down boundaries and break down our expectations, and to really, so just that ability to re-envision, that what things can be, what relationships can be, what, subvert expectations.
The limits of imagination are have been completely blown apart by queer and trans youth right now. I want to live in the world that queer and trans youth are imagining right now. 14-year-olds, 13-year-olds are actually, I don't want a job. What I want is a piece of land and all of my queer and trans friends to be around. And how about we don't do school? How about we teach each other skills? So I think queer and trans youth bring an imagination that we are blessed to have.
There is a deep well of creativity that you need in order to be able to navigate systems that were not built for you.
Youth and young adults bring a lot of asset to their community in terms of creativity, new and generative ideas, as well as a lot of capacity for building relationships and developing their own values.
Queer folks, I think, can be great organizers in all kinds of ways, when action's needed.
Most of the LGBTQ plus organizers that I know started when they were in their teens or their early 20s. Because they had to, at 14, organize their school to get the teachers to actually listen to them and give them and their friends what they wanted. Or at 17, when they were trying to figure out college stuff, they had to figure out how to become an emancipated minor because their family wouldn't support them. And there was no way they'd be able to go to school without that. Or at 19, to be able to transition on the job. And they had to fight that because they didn't have anybody else in their corner. These are all things that young queer and trans folks are doing. And again, no, not all of them, but all of them are fighting for something.
When I see queer and trans folks, specifically in places of leadership and in taking up space in spaces, I see that as revolution and tearing down the system. So for me, I think that queer and trans kids bring that, whether they recognize it or not. That's our life journey of not finding our voice, but being given the space to share our voice. That's one of the big things that I see that they bring. Their existence, their being, their taking up space brings so much that folks don't recognize.
Kids are bringing support for each other, and then that spreads out to the wider community. Because when kids are well, I don't have access to these things that I need, and then they create it for themselves, and then they create it for other people. And I think it's just sharing that that support that they need widely. It's kind of crazy cool how that happens, but it does wherever you are.
Their amazing sense of community and their ability to come together to support their peers.
I was talking to my partner, Laura, about this question because they actually teach youth in Michigan, and they said that their queer youth are great at cultivating and seeking community. And I was like, oh yeah, duh. If you are having to work harder to find community, this means that you can really be good at finding resources and people to relate to, which can then translate to helping others do the same who aren't queer.
Kids bring all kinds of things, and gay, trans, queer, gender nonconforming kids bring all of that, and then also a need for us to support them and change the way this world works that makes them feel terrible sometimes, or even want to not be in this world. So they bring a need for us to do a lot better as adults.
Life is about supporting them, for them to recognize what they bring. Because again, to circle back to that phrase, their existence is for me revolution and revolt. Them just taking up space, that's all they need to do.
We're not just tragedy, and we're not just struggle.
Yeah.
But we have some amazing things to offer also.